Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kara Chucharelli, and I am the Sales Operations Manager here at Foundation Software. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar with Dr. Anirban Basu. We are extremely excited to have Dr. Basu join us here just about a month after the presidential election and as we near the end of quarter 4. We've come together to see how his economic predictions have held up this quarter, if recent events have changed his mind, and what he's predicting as we face fiscal year 2025. While many of you know his work, I would be remiss not to mention his background. Dr. Basu is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Sage Policy Group, Inc., and the chief economist for Associated Builders and Contractors, chief economic advisor for the Construction Financial Management Association, chair of the Baltimore County Economic Advisory Committee, and former chair of the Maryland Economic Development Commission. He serves similar functions for Visit Baltimore, Maryland Realtors, and Markham LLC. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University, a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, a Master's in Economics from the University of Maryland, College Park, a Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland School of Law, and has completed doctoral work at UMBC with a concentration in health economics. He's currently the Distinguished Economist in Residence at Goucher College, where he teaches the history of economics thought, and has previously lectured at Johns Hopkins University in micro, macro, international, and urban economics. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the legendary Dr. Anirban Basu to discuss our post-election economic outlook with you all.
Yeah, that was thank you for that introduction. It was freakishly upbeat for an introduction for an economist, as we economists normally do not merit such introductions. But nonetheless, this is the 2024 fourth quarter economic update. I will leave some time at the end of this for your questions. With respect to assessing how my predictions have fared, let's not do that. There's no point. Who wins from that kind of thing? Let's just talk about where the economy is right now and what we might anticipate going forward. And so I know the world seems like a mess. I get that. And it is a mess in many ways. I mean, the Syrian government fell just this week. It's just another week in the world. And so 25 million people, their government falls. But despite that, actually global economic conditions and US economic conditions could actually be worse. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the estimates for 2024 growth, so the year that's just about completed from the International Monetary Fund, this year the US economy is expected to grow, if you look down the slide, 2.8%. Not bad. The global economy, if you look at that blue colored bar at the top of the slide, that's 3.2%. And actually the International Monetary Fund's forecast for global economic growth next year is 3.2%, pretty stable. It's not great economic growth, by the way. It's pretty soft by historic standards, but nonetheless, it's global economic growth. The global economy, despite all this chatter about trade wars and all these other kinds of things, is expanding. There are two green colored bars on that slide. You see that? These pertain to very large agglomerations of nations. So that first green colored bar, the advanced economies, relates to the group of countries down through the United States. And they're expected to grow this year 1.8%. Next year, they're expected to grow 1.8%. That's the forecast from the International Monetary Fund for 2025. And again, the US economy estimated to end this year having grown 2.8%. You can see the Spanish economy in pretty good shape from a growth perspective. The German economy barely growing. Actually, we got some news today from the European Central Bank indicating that Europe continues to be very weak. In fact, the European Central Bank cut interest rates today. Now, if you look at that green colored bar down below, that relates to the emerging market and developing economies of the world. So that's the bulk of the world's population, as it turns out. You can see some performances here. The Indians perform very, very well. The Chinese very badly by their standards. Their growth target for this year had been 5%. They'll fall short of that. And next year's outlook for them is 4.5%. I'll come back to the salience of some of that later on during the presentation. The Brazilian economy is growing again. Next year is forecast to grow 2.2% after growing 3% this year. So again, it could be worse. Let's take a deeper dive into the economy we might care most about, which is of course the US economy. These are quarterly data, annualized rates of growth. Much of the data I'll show you today are time series data, so the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. The last quarter for which we have data, of course, the third quarter of 2024, a quarter in which the U.S. economy expands 2.8% on an annualized basis. Now we're more than 2/3, basically 5/6 of the way through the fourth quarter of the year. The Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP Now, which estimates current quarter GDP, and the estimate presently is that the U.S. economy is on pace to grow 3.3% on an annualized basis during the current quarter. These are above trend rates of growth. And I'll admit to you that the economy has outperformed my expectations repeatedly over the last couple of years. For instance, coming into last year, coming into 2023, recession was viewed as being inevitable in America. Indeed, the economists at Bloomberg, that source of phenomenal business intelligence, maintained a forecasting index. And as of October of 2022, that index was suggesting that the probability of recession in America was 100%. And you may be aware as professionals that that's the highest possible probability. That in fact, you cannot get beyond 100%, unless of course you talk about the Baltimore Ravens defense, which as you've heard gives 110%. But otherwise, 100% is the most. 2022 was a terrible year for the U.S. equity markets. It was also the year that interest rates took off, and of course, construction is an interest rate sensitive segment of the economy, and these were thought to be precursors to a broad-based economic downturn. It just has not occurred. Now, I know you get excited by these GDP data. I get that. I do too. I do too. We have that in common. So let me break down for you the growth in GDP. So again, during the third quarter of the year, the U.S. economy grew 2.8%. If you look towards the bottom, you'll see four categories: personal consumption, expenditures, gross private domestic investment, net exports of goods and services, government spending. If you were to add up those numbers, you would get something that would round to 2.8%. You can do that now if you want to in your head. There's no point. Trust me, it's 2.8%. But the point is, now you see these bars here, these color shaded bars. I'm trying to get at what's driving economic growth. Now, what drives economic growth is also driving driving construction activity, as it turns out. So we'll get to the construction data later on in the presentation. But if you look at the left-hand set of bars, the personal consumption expenditures, what's driving growth? The consumer. The consumer's been on a spending tear. So it's on services, it's on non-durable goods, things like apparel, it's on durable goods, things like automobiles, for instance, things that last more than 3 years. You look at the second category, that's where your construction data show up, non-residential fixed investment, that includes non-residential construction, adding to growth. But then you'll see another category, it's abbreviated residential fixed investment, that's your home building. And that's where we've seen some backtreading, we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. The third category, net exports of goods and services. So imports grew really rapidly during the third quarter. Well, of course, the consumer is spending like crazy, and a lot of what they buy is imported. So that's subtracted from economic growth 1.3 percentage points from that 2.8 performance. And that probably will attract the attention of the incoming Trump administration. They don't like trade deficits. They don't like expanding trade deficits. And so that's part of that tariff discussion that we hear about. And maybe we'll talk about that more during the presentation. And then the last column there is government spending, and that includes national defense. So we're spending a ton on defense, more than $800 billion a year. State and local governments have been expanding expenditures, and that includes on things like school construction, for instance. So we'll come back to that later on in the presentation. So now, what's the other big story beyond economic growth? Well, one could make the argument that this is an overheated economy. This has been the other major force impacting the economy, inflation, or characterizing the economy. This is based on the consumer price index. There are two lines here. The green line represents the change in the overall rate of inflation over any given 12-month period. So what this says is that between November of 2023 and November of 2024, overall inflation running at 2.7%. You say, Anirban, that's pretty great. I look at this. I mean, look, back in June of 2022, inflation is running at 9% year over year. Now it's down 2.7%. Hurrah! If you do a simple extrapolation, inflation must be neatly headed towards that 2% target maintained by the Federal Reserve, their measure of price stability, but not so fast. You see that green line there at the end? See how it's trending upwards? Like, you got the CPI data for November yesterday. Inflation ran a little bit hot. There are all kinds of reasons for this. We'll get into that. Now, if you strip out food and energy prices, you got that dark blue line, all items less food and energy, so-called core inflation. And that's running at 3.3% year over year. So this final leg back down to 2% inflation is going to be challenging for the Federal Reserve. And that suggests, all things being equal, higher prices for longer, but also higher interest rates for longer. And that's not good for things like real estate and construction, as it turns out. So not to get too ominous here, but now, you know, the consumer's been, of course, dealing with a lot of inflation in recent years. What has helped to offset those higher prices is higher incomes. And what has helped to produce those higher incomes is the fact that the labor market has performed quite neatly. So this from the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. In October, America home to 7.7 million available unfilled jobs. You might say, Anirban, I noticed the number of job openings is falling. It has been falling over time since peaking in 2022. But still, we have more job openings in this country than unemployed people. The ratio of job openings to unemployed people is 1.1, as it turns out. And we have more job openings in this economy now than we did pre-pandemic, when the economy was considered to be very, very strong. Back then, we had a 3.5% rate of unemployment nationally. That was a 50-year low back then. We had about 7 million available unfilled jobs, now 7.7 million. But it has been falling. I'm going to make the case that this labor market is getting a bit softer. And you might note that construction job openings have fallen substantially over the past year. So coming into the year, we had about 450,000 available unfilled construction job openings. The last reading was 249,000. That's a big dip. Rarely do you see such a big dip in job openings. Now, if you look from a historical perspective, look across the entire green line here, which stretches back to 2015, it doesn't look that bad. But over the last year, we've seen construction job openings slip. Now, what's my sense of this? My sense is that many contractors have managed now to fill job openings associated with lower skilled occupational categories. But they're still struggling to hire the most skilled construction workers, not enough electricians and HVAC professionals, that kind of technical staff, carpenters. That kind of technician is in still short supply, and contractors still scrambling for those types of folks. So a mixed bag here, but the point is, historically, we still have a fair number of job openings in the economy. And when a nation comes into each and every month with job openings, it is quite likely that that ensuing month, the nation will end up adding jobs, which is exactly what America has done since December of 2020. So December of 2020 was a pandemic intensive, COVID intensive month. So through wildfires and hurricanes, elections, bridge collapses, you name it, America's managed to add jobs every month since December of 2020. The last reading here is for November of 2024. Again, this is monthly job growth or monthly job change. And in November, America adds 277,000 jobs. Now, it came after a very weak October, when the nation added 36,000 jobs. Of course, in October, the nation impacted by storms. The same was true in September, as it turns out, Helene and then Milton, and so on and so forth. So the jobs numbers have been difficult to interpret. November appears to have been a month during which some of these jobs came back after that destruction, particularly in states like North Carolina, by the way. North Carolina sustained more than $50 billion in damage, which of course means a lot of reconstruction work going forward. But in any case, so really quite remarkable. And I would say that based on the totality of the data, whether it's the job openings data or the job growth numbers, the labor market is still quite strong. And one of the things that we've observed over the past couple of years has been the flexing of its musculature by labor. Labor has flexed its musculature. So one of the things that affected the October jobs number, which again was very weak at 36,000, was a Boeing machinist strike. You might remember in early October, we had a strike among the International Longshoremen's Association members. By the way, about 8.3% of longshoremen are longshore women. We had strikes last year among actors and writers. That's one of the reasons that we did not have an early summer movie blockbuster. So last year we had Barbie and Oppenheimer, quite different films, I think you'd agree, but still both smash hits. This year took a long time over the course of summer to get our first smash hit. Turned out to be Deadpool and Wolverine, and I want to thank both of them for that. But we weren't producing as much content during those actors and writers strikes. And so, it's been a time of fairly rapid wage growth. And so, and again, why has this been happening? Because employers in general have been so keen to staff up. So this is the U.S. Number of U.S. jobs recovered sector specific wise, I mean, by sector since February of 2020. So if you go back to February of 2020 as the baseline, why that month? That's the last month before we shut down the economy pre-pandemic. So if you go back to February of 2020 and compare job totals by industry back then and compare those job totals to November of 2024 job totals, this is what you get. So you can see at number 4 there, construction firms in the aggregate have increased their staffing by almost 700,000 people. It's a huge number, by the way. Now, there's some segments of the economy that are bigger, like health services, professional business services, that's your white collar jobs in many instances, and your supply chain, retail, trade, wholesale trade, transportation, utilities, that's your fulfillment center worker and your truck driver. So those industries are often, much bigger in terms of total employment, and they've actually hired more people in absolute terms than construction, but construction is very much the vanguard. Construction now has about 8 million workers. I mean, in percentage growth terms, this is really rapid growth in construction employment since February of 2020. But again, because of this rapid hiring, a lot of the job openings that had previously existed are no longer in existence. Those job openings have been filled. Now, again, as I say, labor market's been quite strong, but it's been weakening at the margins. And that becomes apparent on this slide. These are the unemployment rates for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in the country. If you look toward the bottom of the right-hand column, you will see that certain regions now have not so low unemployment rates. Los Angeles, 5.6%, Riverside, 5.5%, Chicagoland, 5.3%, Detroit Metro, 5%. I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill, but these unemployment rates are higher than you would have observed a year ago, or even a quarter ago. So we are starting to see some slack in the labor market. Construction job openings are down, that kind of thing. And you might ask the question based on that, well, does that mean that construction firms won't have to pay such high wages, or at least that wage growth won't be so rapid? And of course, if construction firms don't have to pay as much for human capital, meaning their talent, or at least that increase in the cost of hiring that talent is not rising so rapidly, then they have more money for software, that kind of thing. I mean, that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here. But so this is the U.S. construction wage premium. I don't know if I've ever shown this slide to you before. So historically, construction workers have made more than their private sector counterparts. So this is for non-supervisory employees. So this is not non-managerial people. These are from the perspective of construction production workers, people actually at job sites delivering construction services. So if you look at that black line that runs east to west across that slide, see that east and west? That represents the average construction wage premium during the 20 years prior to the pandemic. So again, construction workers are specially trained. They're often forced to work unusual hours, often having to wake up very early in the morning. No one likes that, by the way. Number 3, they often work in unpleasant conditions, often exposed to the great outdoors, and it's often physically demanding work. So historically, they have made about 21.7% more than their private sector counterparts, at least during the 20 years prior to the pandemic on average. If you look at that green colored line superimposed on that black line, that's the construction wage premium at any given moment in time, and the November figure was 18.5%. In other words, that construction wage premium has declined. You say, Anirban, that's impossible. Construction workers make more than they've ever made. How can this possibly be? Because we've seen even more aggressive compensation increases in other segments of the economy. That's that fulfillment center Amazon, that fulfillment center worker at Amazon that makes far more than they used to, or the cashier at McDonald's in California who now makes $25 an hour, unthinkable a couple of years ago, that kind of thing. It's that UPS truck driver, right? I mentioned that labor had been flexing this musculature. Well, some negotiations did not end in strike. So last year we had the negotiations between the Teamsters Union and United Parcel Service. Those negotiations produced a 5-year agreement, and during the 5th year of that agreement, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 per year. Yeah, that's right, that's $170K. That's wages plus benefits, it's $170K. Force the people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And based on the app, spectacular. But the point is, that's great for consumption. That's great for the 2/3 of the economy that is household spending. But it means that construction firms are going to have to compete that much harder to attract the human capital of the future. I do not begrudge the UPS truck driver that level of compensation, by the way. I don't at all. These are very special people. They have to be able to drive a large vehicle, have to be able to park it, have to lift heavy objects all day long, as much as 70 pounds, and pass a drug test. Most Americans can't do all of those things, but construction workers can. They can drive a large vehicle, they can park it, they can lift heavy objects all day long, and they can pass a drug test, at least as a general proposition. And with construction facing so much retirement during the next few years, I mean, many of our most skilled craftspeople are in their 50s, maybe even their 60s. They're going to retire in large numbers going forward. That's going to mean the industry is going to be that much more challenged to attract that human capital, particularly in those most skilled occupation categories. Now, again, there's a flip side to everything economic. So while all this compensation growth has been great for fueling consumer spending, it's also inflationary. So we talked about that inflation rates continue to be quite high relative to historic norms. The Federal Reserve is out there trying to combat that. They have a dual mandate. They want to keep the economy as close to full employment as possible while keeping inflation at their 2% target, their measure of price stability. And the Federal Reserve's principal mechanism for influencing economic growth as byproduct of inflation is right here, the federal funds rate, also known as the Fed funds rate, also known as the overnight bank lending rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight. And why would a bank do that? Because banks require a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of themselves, and occasionally banks run up against that constraint. When this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, thereby shoring up their reserves, thereby lending more aggressively in the economy. When this rate is set at a higher level, an opposing behavior ensues. Now that burst of inflation, that above 2% or that target inflation, shows up in early 2021. The Federal Reserve sees that in the data. They don't do anything about it. They don't raise interest rates that year. They think that inflation is purely transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think it's purely supply chain driven. The supply chain's normalized post-pandemic, and as employees are rehired by their employers, that inflation just naturally abate to that 2% level we'd enjoyed for many years prior to the pandemic. Indeed, for many years prior to the pandemic, the Federal Reserve had a tough time getting inflation up to 2%. It was often stuck at around 1.75% post-global financial crisis. Instead, the Federal Reserve appears to have presided over the creation of that wage price spiral. So prices take off in early 2021. Employees notice, boss, I need a raise. I can't afford my life anymore. And if you don't give me that raise, I'll find an employer who'll give me what I need. And of course, that is a period of frenetic job switching within the US labor market. Boss says, no problem. I need you. The economy's come back very, very quickly post-pandemic. There's lots of unmet demand out there, including for construction services. I'll give you a raise, but I'll just pass on my cost increase to my customers and clients. That's that wage price spiral. And the Federal Reserve allows that to get out of hand in 2021 because they don't do anything about it. Now, about a year after this, March 17th of 2022, they start raising rates. Even then, they only dip their toes in inflation-fighting waters. That day, raising rates 0.25 percentage points, but next meeting 0.5 percentage points. Next 4 meetings consecutively 0.75 percentage points each meeting, then back to 0.5 percentage points, then 0.25, then 0.25. May 3rd of last year, 0.25, pause in June, July 26th, 0.25%, then pause for 8 meetings. September 18th of this year, the first rate cut happened to be half a percentage point. That had the stock market very excited because there was some thinking it might just be a quarter point. And then 2 days after the election, that meeting, November 7th, the Federal Reserve cuts again by 0.25 percentage points, again at that November 7th meeting. And so the upper limit on the federal funds rate, which is being graphed for you here, has gone from 5.5% to 4.75%. The Federal Reserve will meet again later this year, December 17th and 18th. Undoubtedly, you will hear that the Federal Reserve will cut rates on December 18th by 0.25 percentage points, and that'll bring this target rate down to 4.5 percentage points. But here's my point. Even with those rate cuts in hand, interest rates will still enter 2025 at a lofty level. And I won't go through all of this, but there's some theory that suggests that there are going to still be some negative impacts from these still high interest rates. So the first bullet comes from Raphael Bostic. It's a quote from him, the highly regarded, highly respected president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve, who says, quote, a large body of research tells us it can take 18 months to 2 years or more for tighter monetary policy to materially affect inflation, and also, by the way, to materially affect the broader economy. So The Federal Reserve started raising rates somewhat more than 2 years ago. This is precisely when you might expect to see the effect of some of these higher interest rates on the economy, including on the construction industry economy. So let's talk about that some more. So let's start talking about real estate and construction, shall we? So two more interest rates of interest. This is the 15 and 30 fixed mortgage rates from Freddie Mac, 30 fixed mortgage rates in blue, 15 fixed mortgage rates in green. These are weekly data, and for the last week for which you have data from Freddie Mac, the average 30 fixed mortgage rate sitting at 6.69%. You say, Anirban, assuredly, you're not going to make a big deal out of a 6.69% 30 fixed mortgage rate, are you? Because I can remember mortgage rates are 18%. And some of you can, some of you can't. But I can remember mortgage rates are 15%. Again, some of you can, some of you can't. But the point is, 6.69% from a long-term historical perspective is actually not that high. But to millennials and Generation Z, the youngest members of our workforce, these rates are preposterously high. And that's who's really dropped out of the first-time home purchasing marketplace. It's been that first-time buyer. Sorry, let me repeat that. This is who's really dropped out of the home purchasing marketplace. It's been that first-time buyer, that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated by lack of inventory, high prices, and by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. Now, let me start showing you some leading economic indicators, because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been happening to a discussion of what's likely to happen going forward. So here's the leading indicator. This is the U.S. Mortgage Loan Applications Composite Index. What do I mean by leading indicator, by the way? It's predictive. Its performance tells us something about the future. So why are mortgage applications a leading indicator? Because often the journey to the settlement table begins with a mortgage application. That's the first indication that we see that somebody out there now seeks to transact. But mortgage applications are now about 78% from their 2021 peak. What does that tell us? There are fewer ready buyers out there, fewer people who are prepared to transact. So, Anirban, if the purchasing population has been so dramatically truncated, housing market must be in horrific shape, but by some measures it's not. Take the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index, and this is a source of frustration to many millennials. Home sales prices in America have never been greater. Now, it's not a big deal for millennials who already own a home, that's true, but for millennials who have yet to purchase and are sitting there paying enormous rents, right? Rents have risen economy-wide, according to the Consumer Price Index, by 25% over the last 4.5 years. So spending a lot of money on rent, more difficult to put a down payment on a home, and home prices in the meanwhile continue to rise. You see that increase in home sales prices during the pandemic and early stages of recovery therefrom? That's a 35% increase in U.S. home sales prices over a very short period of time. But of course, during the pandemic, our behavior changed. We want more house because we're spending more time at home. So we want more square footage. We needed space for home offices and home gyms. We wanted one room just for the Peloton. I mean, anytime you see a Peloton advertisement, the only piece of furniture in that room is the Peloton. That's how we Americans seek to live. You buy a Peloton, you put it in a room, lock the door. And then, of course, when people visit, you open the door, you splash some water on it. Many of us have done it. But the point is, then the pandemic ended, mortgage rates took off. So what was I thinking naively? That we'd give back a meaningful chunk of these home sales price gains. You could see it happen for a few months, but not very long and not very deep. What did I fail to fully appreciate as an economist? What did I get wrong as an economist? So I understood that there are fewer buyers out there. What I failed to fully appreciate was the fact that there'd be so few sellers. I should have known that, because if you're sitting in Duluth, Minnesota, or Kankakee, Illinois with a 2.75% 30-year fixed, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. You're going to be carted out of that house. You're going to leave that house in an ambulance. So you don't have many buyers, but you also don't have many sellers. So you're stuck with a high equilibrium sales price. In fact, let me break this down for you further. This is the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index by metropolitan area, 12-month percentage change up until September of 2024. So I'm just comparing sales prices in these various communities between September of 2023 and September of 2024. I think you would agree that New York Metro is already a quite expensive place in which to live. Prices have gone up another 7.5% in just the last 12 months. Cleveland, Chicago, Las Vegas, Detroit, you can read these cities' names. You can see, chunky increases in home sales prices. Now, I talked about economic theory, didn't I? I talked about lag effects of higher interest rates, that eventually they come to permeate the market, those higher interest rates. It's not immediate. It can take more than 2 years. And so this is a 12-month percentage change in home price index. What if I showed you the 1-month percentage change? Oh, it's a different story now, isn't it? You see the 0% line running north and south through the slide? Los Angeles, home sales prices fell in September. San Francisco, San Diego, Denver, Dallas, Boston. So again, not massive decreases or declines in home sales prices, admittedly, but still a reversion from what had been the pre-existing trend. And again, that's that lag effect. And if you're a home builder and you're looking at this, you're saying, that's not great. That's not a great emerging trend, because this means that in a year from now, if this trend were to continue, I might get less for my newly built home than I might now. So, some dynamics related to interest rates still yet to work through the economy, even though the Federal Reserve has begun its rate cutting cycle. This, of course, affects, as I mentioned, construction dynamics. So here's another leading economic indicator. This is U.S. residential building permits. And permits are a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build. The orange line there is single-family building permits. And you say, Anirban, that doesn't look so bad. It doesn't, does it? Especially if you can ignore the housing bubble period of, let's say, 04, 05, 06, when we were probably building too many homes based on our demographics, too much speculation in the housing market. If you can try to ignore that period, from a long-term perspective, this looks pretty good. I mean, permits are above 2016, 2017, pre-pandemic years. So anyway, how's that possible? You just said the millennials, our most populous generation, the oldest of that group will turn 44 this year, parenthetically. You just said the millennials are having a tough time transacting. Why, under such economic and demographic circumstances, are single-family builders still pulling so many permits? Because there's so few existing homes for sale that single-family builders are still spying opportunities to meet unmet demand, including among millennials, by the way. So if you look at the size of the newly constructed American home, it's shrinking in terms of square footage. Why? Because increasingly home builders are trying to meet millennials where they are financially. That means less square footage, fewer windows, ultimately translates to less heating costs, becomes more affordable. So, some millennials, of course, have done extremely well financially, as we know. So, still, housing affordability is a major issue for much of the generation. Now, the loss of momentum here is in that green colored line. That's multifamily. That relates to future apartments to be constructed. Now, don't get me wrong. We built a ton of apartments in this country in the last few years, a ton of them. Multifamily construction has been a red hot segment. This relates to the next generation of apartments to be constructed, which is going to be much smaller in amplitude. You say, why, Anirban? Again, you keep seeing the millennials, our most populous generation. There are millions of them. They're all turning 44 this year. Many of them are around their 30s, right? They're having children, getting married, often in that order, and they need a place to live. They can't live with their parents forever. They can try, but they shouldn't. So if they can't buy a house, they're going to be leasing an apartment. Yeah, so I would think lease activity is quite strong. Yeah, it is. Though you will notice that in certain markets, like Nashville, Tennessee, or Austin, Texas, apartment rents have been falling recently. I delivered a presentation about a month ago in Nashville, Tennessee. My goodness, what a gorgeous downtown they have built. They've done a phenomenal job with that city, no question about it. But one of the things that you note with respect to newly constructed apartment units is that many of them are being offered 2 months free rent. You didn't see that a few months ago. So maybe some segments of the apartment market have been overbuilt in Nashville. In Austin, you see the same kind of dynamic as well. Also, one of the things that you're seeing is that many apartment buildings now are selling for a lower price than the previous purchase price, which renders their value as bank collateral shakier. And that's why that line is dropping. It's not because of underlying demographics. It's because project financing has become more challenging. So, about a year and a half ago, a bit more than that, we suffered the failures of Silicon Valley Bank on March 10th and Signature Bank on March 12th. Now, these were considered to be mid-sized banks, but if you look at the ranking, they're both top 20 banks at the time of their failure. So they're big banks. And now that had very little to do with real estate exposure, perhaps nothing to do with real estate exposure. But in the aftermath of that, banks have become more cautious in their lending, and regulators have become more aggressive in their regulating. And real estate is viewed by many financiers as risky. And sometimes developers can get their projects financed, but their interest rate they're being offered, the interest that they're being offered is so high, their pro forma no longer pencils out. And even on a pro forma, you can only raise your rent so high. Now, this dynamic extends beyond multifamily construction. So let's talk a bit more about that. Let's do a bit more spotlight on construction activity. Let me go big here. This is total non-residential construction spending. It's what it is. But there are two lines here. That green colored line is total non-residential construction spending. And you look at that and say, Anirban, no wonder contractors have been so busy. No wonder they've been buying so much software from us. They've had a lot of projects to manage. Though, two things to note there with that green line. One is things have flattened out more recently. You see that? And the second thing to note is that this is not just for inflation. So why are things flattened out? My thesis would be obvious. That's the lag effects from those higher interest rates starting to really pervade the economy and hit the non-residential construction spending data. What was being built before? Often projects that were financed when interest rates were low. What's being built now? Projects that have managed to be financed even though borrowing costs are high. Well, in some segments, at least of construction, there are fewer of those projects moving forward. We are still, of course, in the era of the mega project. So if we're talking about data centers, manufacturing facilities, we will talk about that more in a moment. Of course, those projects are moving forward because they're not so sensitive to interest rates. There are other things happening in the economy that don't make that kind of construction so sensitive to interest rates. But construction of hotels, apartment buildings, office buildings, that is very interest rate sensitive often. Moreover, with that, so that green line, it's not just for inflation. So if you adjust for inflation, you get the darker blue cut line down below. And now the increase doesn't look so impressive. So a lot of the growth in construction spending is not because users of construction services are receiving more services, it's because they are spending more for each unit of service received. That's that construction inflation that we see. The cost of building a typical average commercial office building, for instance, up about 40% since February of 2020. Now, let me break this down for you further. So as defined by the US Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. What this slide shows you is the percentage change in spending between February of 2020. Again, why that month? That's the last month before we shut down the economy. The public health emergency is declared on March 13th. So I'm using February of 2020 as the pre-pandemic level of construction spending versus October of 2024. So since February of 2020, overall non-residential construction spending is up 39.1%. Big number, again, not adjusted for inflation. If you strip out inflation, it's less than 20%. But in any case, now in green, you see that what's been happening categorically. What's the number one category in terms of triggering construction spending growth or non-residential construction spending growth? It's manufacturing, by far. What's happening? Supply chains coming back home to America. After decades of supply chain leaving these shores, it's coming back and coming back quite quickly. Some of that's because of federal subsidies. President Biden in August of 2022 signed both the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of this is because manufacturers want to simplify their logistics, don't want to have to traverse the Pacific Ocean or try to get through the Red Sea past Houthi rebels, Somali pirates into the Suez Canal. So all kinds of things happening, around the world that people want to bring production back to the United States and to North America generally. So that leads to a lot of manufacturing facility development, particularly in the categories of electronics. That's a battery technology, computer chip manufacturing. That's where we see a lot of those mega projects. You'll also notice the public sector is overrepresented here. So on November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. So you see categories like water supply, sewage and waste disposal, which is about 95% publicly financed, and highway and street at the vanguard of growth. Now, where do you see the loss in or the sluggishness in spending growth? Lodging, that's hotel room construction, for instance. Now, hotel room construction has been flattish this year, down only slightly, but over the long course of longer time period, it's deeply negative. And again, not just for inflation. So if you just for inflation, it's even worse. As it turns out, we built a ton of hotel rooms during the 5 years prior to the pandemic. Now, the office category is interesting because the office category includes data center construction. And data center construction, of course, is fast, fierce, and frenetic, and will continue to be. That's artificial intelligence, for instance, and the fact that these hyperscalers just cannot get enough capacity to handle data storage and processing. But again, overall growth in this segment of the economy. Now, let me talk about materials prices briefly. So this is the Construction Materials Producer Price Index. 12% percentage change in prices through November of 2024. And unlike a couple of years ago when materials prices were surging higher, I mean, you might remember the price of steel and softwood lumber, those kinds of things coming out of the pandemic, surging higher. That's not so much the case anymore. Softwood lumber prices are up 11.8%. That might be because Donald Trump got elected, and some people are starting to buy softwood lumber in advance of tariffs that might be placed on Canadian softwood lumber. So a rush of orders for softwood lumber might be driving up the price right now. Non-ferrous wire and cable largely reflects copper prices. Global copper prices have been edging higher recently. But if you look toward the bottom of the slide, you can see iron and steel prices down over the past year. Steel mill product prices down over the past year. Natural gas down massively over the past year. So overall, we do not see the level of construction material price inflation that we saw a couple of years ago. Now, that brings me to another couple of measures of inflation. I find this index to be quite interesting. Hopefully you will agree. So what I'm doing for you here is I'm juxtaposing two producer price indices. I'm taking each of these producer price indices and starting with February of 2020 and trying to determine how much those price indices increased or cost indices increased between February of 2020 and now. So if you look at these two lines, the green line represents construction input cost inflation. And the blue line represents construction bid price increases starting with February of 2020. Okay, now look at late 2020 and 2021. What do you see? The green line is ahead of the blue line because that's when construction input costs were rising very, very quickly. And that's when a lot of contractors called their attorneys and asked the question, do we have a force majeure clause in this contract? Because we're taking a bath. We did not build these input cost increases into our bids. We'd like to get out from under the contract or at least renegotiate. And of course, the opposing counsel often said, well, you knew there was a pandemic, didn't you? In any case. Now, economic theory would predict what? So construction is a highly fragmented competitive industry. Something approaching perfect competition in economic theory. And by the way, a lot of people will say to you, and I know a lot of you are young people, a lot of people will say to you, I love competition. It brings out the best in me. I hate competition. I'm a small business owner, and I'm also a fairly religious person, as it turns out. So I pray every night. I'll pray for our nation's well-being, and the whole world, of course. I'll pray for my community. I'll pray for my family. I'll pray for the Ravens secondary. It's not working. I'll pray for the Orioles young pitching staff, ditto. And I'll pray for my competitors to die, preferably violently. And so I don't like competition. I'd rather just have the market to myself. But in any case, construction is very competitive, very fragmented. So what economic theory would predict is that in the long run, under perfect competition, economic profits, which are different from accounting profits, by the way, but economic profits equals zero. The economic theory would predict that over time, these two lines will converge. That's exactly what's happened. So bid costs have risen to the point where basically exactly equal to the increase in construction input costs since February 2020. Pretty cool, huh? That's economic theory at work. All right, so what are some other emerging issues out there? Let's talk about those. And just give me about 5 more minutes and then we'll go to Q&A. So again, Americans have been spending aggressively and sometimes they're paying for that using their credit card. So credit card debt is higher. A lot of economists would say, well, it's still not that problematic because if you adjust for inflation, it doesn't look so bad and delinquency rates are still not that high in terms of credit card debt. Fair enough. And the consumer certainly is spending, they're still traveling, so on and so forth. So, but it's an emerging issue. It's something to watch for going forward. In fact, more Americans have been having a tough time fulfilling their basic financial obligations. This is a percentage of balances 30+ days delinquent by loan type. That green line there is credit card delinquency. It's been rising, generally speaking. The yellow line there's all loan delinquency. It's been rising. The brown line down below is mortgage delinquency. I think you'd agree that the mortgage payment's a pretty important payment to miss. Now, again, mortgage delinquency is rising off an absurdly low level. So I appreciate that it's not a macroeconomic issue right now, but it does tell me that there's a bit more, or maybe a bit more than a bit more, stress on household balance sheets, right? That some consumers are just not going to be able to spend the way they have been. In fact, I would say to you that some fraction of American consumers or households is already in recession, meaning their living standards are falling right now because their incomes are no longer growing fast enough to offset all these inflationary pressures, whether it's their electricity bill, their grocery bill, their auto insurance, health insurance, whatever it happens to be. Yeah, another issue is, of course, the U.S. office vacancy rate continues to be quite high and rising based on CoStar data and other data. If you look at CB Richard Ellis data, it'll show you that the downtown San Francisco office vacancy rate is around 36% and screaming towards 40%. Los Angeles around 33%. Seattle, you see that skyline, that's a lot of office space, 32% vacant. And we care, of course, about the building owners, naturally. Many of them are construction firm clients and customers. But we also care about the fact that banks are exposed to this, right? That when you've got so much vacancy in America, that drives down the value of office buildings, and that could be someone's collateral, some bank's collateral. And as that collateral value sinks, and if it sinks so far, that could be a real problem for banks. So that shoe is yet to drop, admittedly. So we economists have been talking about this real estate situation, the office market in particular, for quite some time, but I see very little evidence thus far of a real pickup in bank failures because of their exposure to commercial real estate, including regional banks that specialize in commercial real estate lending. But it's, again, an emerging issue, something to watch for going forward. And that brings us to the outlook. So U.S. economy has momentum right now, but there's some underlying risks. It could slow going forward. Now, let's talk about optimism. Are people optimistic? Let's talk about small business in particular. This is from the National Federation of Independent Business. It's their index of small business optimism. Question: Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? So in recent months, 4% had said yes, 4% had said yes. The 1 month it was 6%, then back to 4%. Akin to what we had seen during the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. You can see it on the slide. And then what happened in November? Donald John Trump was re-elected president of the United States. And what happened to small business optimism? It has been surging ever since. Not back to where it had been during the peak of the Trump years, so the peak of the Trump years, the first term, but rising. A lot of small business operators are quite conservative. They don't like regulation. One of the things that the president has said is he wants deregulation. But a couple of things he said would actually be quite inflationary. Deregulation in and of itself is not necessarily inflationary, but other aspects of his platform are inflationary, meaning they would tend to increase prices faster. Things like tariffs, of course, tax cuts, which push more money into the economy, that's inflationary. And then, of course, deportation. A lot of these undocumented migrants or workers, including construction, by the way, but also agriculture and landscaping, so on and so forth. And so when, if there's an effort actually to deport people who are working, that shrinks the size of the labor force, and that would tend to be inflationary. So something to think about. And that, by the way, would keep interest rates higher for longer, which if you're in real estate and construction, that's not what you want. There's been some evidence, by the way, that business hiring has been softening. This is the US hires rate. So this is the number of hires in the economy in any given month divided by number of people receiving a paycheck. So we've been in the midst of that virtuous cycle in which consumers have been spending, impacted employers have been hiring, which is fueling further spending. But now we're starting to see hiring fade a little bit. I showed you a moment ago those regional unemployment rates, Los Angeles and Riverside and all those things. Unemployment no longer so low. We got a report this morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on initial unemployment claims. Those are up to 242,000 for the week. Again, shouldn't make so much out of a week of data, but there's some evidence out there that this labor market is starting to soften and will take the broader economy with it. The Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators also signals further slowing ahead. This is an index that predicted the 2001 recession, predicted 07, 08, 09. Is not telling us something more wicked this way comes. And what's the thesis, obviously, at least my thesis? This is the index picking up those lag effects from those higher interest rates, yet to fully pervade the economy. So I understand the Federal Reserve has started to lower interest rates. I'm talking about the lag effects for when interest rates are even higher than they are now, and the fact that interest rates are still, even with the recent rate cuts, high. They're still constrictive to growth. And so that's, again, one of the reasons I think the economy is going to soften. I'm not alone, by the way. If you look at major economic forecasts for US GDP growth, the green color bars are 2024 estimates. The blue color bars are 2025 estimates. International Monetary Fund is the first couple of bars on the left. World Bank is in the middle. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is on the right-hand side. Everyone predicts just about the US economy is going to soften just a bit next year. And my thinking would be the US economy ends up growing around 2.8% this year, but closer to 2% next year. It's not recession, obviously. That's not recession, but it is softer economic growth. So look, why am I so, why do I have this tendency to expect slower economic growth? Well, we're a deeply indebted society currently facing high borrowing costs. And so that makes me a bit pessimistic. And of course, we've got geopolitics all over the world and federal policy uncertainty. Those don't help because many people, take a wait and see attitude when they're so concerned and distracted and feel that the environment is risky. And that's one of the things you're hearing from a lot of construction firms, of course, that these project owners are not ready to press the green button yet on these projects. They're taking a wait and see attitude. They want to see what the tax code looks like. They want to see what immigration looks like. They want to see what tariffs look like before they decide to move ahead with the project and deploy capital that they might otherwise want to deploy in another place or another part of the economy. So I think it's supposed to slow down next year, but baseline case no longer calls for recession. If you like this kind of analysis, I have a newsletter at www.sagecon.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily dollars for dollars. If you're not interested in the newsletter, please, anytime, go ahead and feel free to pound sand. And with that, hey, thanks a lot for the opportunity to be with you today. I left about 10 minutes for Q&A, which is about 10 minutes longer than I'd hoped to leave. But nonetheless, let's go to that right now. Here we go, Q&A. Let's hear the questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have additional questions you haven't already sent through, you can do so in the questions box and go to webinar, and we will get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. So the first one we've got here, you mentioned, geopolitics and federal policy just now. Has Trump's recent win changed your economic outlook yet, or is it too early to tell?
It did not change my economic outlook. Why? Because I thought he was going to win. I mean, I said from the very beginning, and this is one of the things I got right in the last couple of years. I've gotten a lot wrong. The economy has vastly outperformed expectations the last couple of years. And when interest rates took off, would I have expected the stock market to boom the way it has? The Dow reached 45,000. The S&P is neatly sitting about 6,000 as I'm speaking to you. Not so much, but those things happened. But one of the things I got right is that I thought Trump was going to win. I thought that it was very difficult for Kamala Harris to win because she was facing a very difficult narrative. Inflation's up, global conflict is up, southern border is a major issue for a lot of Americans. And I just thought that if she failed to distinguish herself from President Biden sufficiently, she was going to lose the election, and that's exactly what happened. But she had a chance to answer the question, what would you have done differently? She said, I can't think of it, nothing comes to mind. That was her losing the election. So I had built into my forecast recently that Trump was going to become, President-elect Trump was going to become the 47th president of the United States. That's exactly what's happened. Now, does that mean that I can't be surprised? Well, of course I'm going to be surprised. What's going to happen with tariffs? Because he can say one thing but do something very different. Everyone tells me, don't take him literally, just take him seriously. You know generally where he's trying to push the country. He wants fair trade for this country. He wants to drive down the trade deficits. Who do we have the most significant trade deficits with? China, Canada, European Union, Mexico, not in that order. So, yeah, I mean, we might see tariffs. What are tax cuts going to look like? And one of the wild cards here is, what is Congress going to let him do? He's got a new Senate Majority Leader in Senator Thune. What's Senator Thune going to do? And I think you're going to hear a lot of discussion about the national debt, which is now $36 trillion, coming out of Congress this year. And so some of these proposed tax cuts may not go very far because Congress, believe it or not, even though it's Republican-led, might push back on some of these things. Finally, what does deportation look like? What does the labor market look like? So I thought Donald Trump was going to win. What I don't know is what he's going to do. No one does. I'm not sure he does, but that's okay. He'll figure it out, I'm sure. But that's the answer to the question. It has not really changed my outlook, but my outlook is subject to further change because, he's going to do some things during his first 100 days that undoubtedly are going to surprise me.
Sure. We have a couple follow-up questions related to that. So one is, you mentioned the IJA, the CHIPS Act, that the old administration kind of put through. Do you think that kind of investment from the federal level will continue? And yeah, they also mentioned, is it too early to tell?
Yeah, I think that investment from the federal level, this may prove to be naive, will not continue. And again, why is that? Well, one of the things that President Trump, the president-elect, has proposed is to cut the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. But you only get that 15% if you manufacture your goods here. So the administration may take the position, look, because we've reduced your corporate tax rate, we don't have to send you direct subsidies anymore. We don't have to do what we're doing with Intel, which is sending them $8 billion to put fabrication plants in Columbus, Ohio, and parts of Arizona. We don't have to do that. We're giving you the tax break. And if, by the way, if you don't produce here, you'll still be subject to a 21% corporate tax rate, which is not particularly onerous by global standards. Right? It's middle of the pack in terms of corporate tax rates. So I think that you'll start to see those subsidies start to go away because of the logic of what I just said, but also because of the national debt. and the government's going to work very hard to try to trim these federal budget deficits. One of the things that we know is that President Trump has nominated Scott Bessent to be Treasury Secretary. Treasury Secretary Bessent, if he becomes that, has proposed the 3 threes. So what are the 3 threes? 3% economic growth, 3 million more barrels of oil per day produced in America, which would take us up to about 16.5 million barrels of oil per day, and no more than a 3% federal budget deficit as a fraction of GDP. Right now we're at 7%. The federal government, between Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Scott Bessent, is going to be looking for all kinds of savings, and that means that probably some of these subsidies go away.
Got it. Additionally, in addition to geopolitics, do you think AI will change your outlooks?
I mean, I'm going to ask AI. AI will undoubtedly know the answer to that question, right? But I don't, because AI is changing all the time in the following sense: its capabilities and its use cases, right? How it's being used in the economy. My very strong belief is that one of the reasons the U.S. economy has outperformed over the last couple of years is because of this AI investment boom, this artificial intelligence boom, and we've not seen anything yet. New platforms are proliferating all the time. You're going to see a lot of artificial intelligence related firms reach initial public offering stages in 2025 and 2026. So these platforms are going to become even bigger as they're more meaningfully capitalized and more meaningfully diffused across the economy. This is going to change life in tourism, financial services, computer programming, many other aspects of economic life. And generally speaking, it's going to vastly improve productivity. Indeed, already there's evidence that AI is improving American productivity. Productivity growth has been pretty strong. Productivity is measured as output per hour worked. And this is certainly true for computer programmers, but other actors in the economy. So I've already built into in my mind that after maybe a bit of a softening in 2025, the US economy takes off in 2026 and beyond. Some of that's because I expect interest rates to be lower, but a lot of that has to do with artificial intelligence and this sort of technology boom that's about to rage through America.
Very interesting. We also have a question on your opinion on multifamily construction in 2025. So you touched on this in your presentation, but can you provide kind of a concise, clear opinion on the direction of that?
Well, based on my previous answers, the answer is no. I cannot be concise and clear, but I'll try to answer the question nonetheless. I think it's not going to be very good. I think you're seeing a lot of multifamily developers basically putting projects on hold because their performers are no longer penciling out. There's some evidence out there that, again, rents are no longer rising and some communities are falling. And these interest rates, these project financing costs are just not coming down. And the cost of construction, even though it's not rising as quickly as it did, let's say in 2022, is still rising. So you put all that together, the math is not working. And again, here's the thing. What did we build in the next couple of years? Luxury apartments. Why do we build so many luxury apartments? People say, oh, that's because these investors are looking for greater profitability. Yeah, that's part of it, but the other part is that's the only thing that could get financed. Those projects were the only ones associated with rents high enough to offset construction development costs. It's very difficult to create more affordable housing in this country because the land is so expensive, workers are so expensive, et cetera. And now money is expensive. So I think 2025 is going to be not a particularly great year for overall multifamily construction activity.
Thank you. Also, considering the high borrowing and delinquent balances you mentioned, do you think the American public will be hesitant to buy and rent or invest in new improvement projects in housing or offices or factories?
Yes, and the key, not as, let me back up a little. Not so much factories, because so much is changing economically that makes factory investment that much more palatable, that much more desirable. So that, and again, supply chain is coming back home. But with respect to multifamily buildings, home improvement projects, yeah, that's not going to be as strong, because often the really big home improvement projects are financed through cash out refinancing, right? I'm borrowing against the equity in my homes. Well, there's lots of equity there, of course. People's homes values have gone up, but the interest rates are too high for people. So they're waiting. So when will we get really a home remodeling boom? It'll be in 2026 and 2027 as mortgage rates come down sufficiently so that people say, oh, yes, I want to refinance that mortgage now. I'm okay with that. I want to do a cash out refinance. I want to take out a second mortgage. and do that kitchen, add the addition to my home, whatever it happens to be, and third bay in the garage, whatever it happens to be. And so that's what I would expect. But this year, because interest rates are going to stay stubbornly high, I would not think it would be a great year for home remodeling, for instance.
Thank you. We're just about at 2 o'clock here, so I think that's all the time we have for everybody's questions. But I'm just going to give you one more opportunity. Do you have any final insights or recommendations for 25 as we head into the new year?
I would just say sell hard and often, and don't take no for an answer, that kind of thing. Obviously, you have your own techniques, but look, the U.S. economy is going to hold up. I think 2025 will be a decent year. It's not going to be as rapid a growth year as we've had, but watch out for the last few years of this decade. They're going to be phenomenal for U.S. economic growth. That's my feeling as interest rates come down and the AI boom takes off. So this is a year that even if that marketing doesn't translate into a direct sale, keep those relationships up, because at some point later this decade, that relationship building is really going to pay dividends.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Basu. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us online. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar for you all shortly, and hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.